garnered actually most of the growth that's occurred since 2008. Most of it has gone to the 1%. They took a big hit during the recession, but they also got most of the returns from the recovery. All right, so let's get started and take a look at what's actually been happening. So the slides I'm going to be showing you are based on work by Emmanuel Saz and Pickney, his co-author Pickney, who has done most of the work in this area. I'm going to pull in some other slides from Alan Kruger when he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and a number of other papers, just to talk to you about what's happened with inequality, why we should care about it, what's happened as a result perhaps to intergenerational income mobility, and then try to figure out maybe some ideas for why this has happened. Can you hear me in the back? Not too well? You can hear me? Well, I'll talk a little bit into this. Okay, talk a bit louder. So let's take a look at what's happened. I do apologize, all of these slides have to be rotated. So we'll see what's going on. All right, so here's the first slide to take a look at what's actually happened to income inequality over time. So as you can see, towards the end of the Gilded Age, as Daniel said, income inequality was very high. All right? And then income inequality, and this is a measure of pre-tax income. Income inequality started to plummet. All right? And one of the reasons for this was that a lot of this inequality at that time was based on capital income as opposed to earnings. And the war destroyed a lot of that capital and destroyed a lot of the earnings, the wealth of the rich and the corresponding earnings. And then the New Deal kicked in and a lot of progressive policies were put in place which made sure that that change in income equality, was locked in place by tax laws, redistributive policies, and things were pretty stable for a while. The top 10%, the top decile, garnering about 35% of income. And then we see, starting in the 1970s, a big change, right? So you see in the 1970s, the share of income grabbed by the top 10% or the top decile in the United States started jumping up. Right? So it went all the way up, and now it's right around 50%. So there's been a huge change in income inequality, and this slide focuses on the top 10%. Now, if you break out that top 10% into groups, you see that it's actually most of that change has been in the top 1%. And hence, Occupy Wall Street people talking about the 1% versus the 99. They know what they're talking about, at least in this regard. All right, so let's take a look at that. I don't have this put together in a nice, pretty PowerPoint presentation, but I'll still be able to see what's happening. All right, so when we break that down into the different groups, you see what we have. So over here, the top 1%, that's this dark line. Sorry, it's not in color. The next from 5% to 1% is right here, and 10 to 5% is here. So if we decompose these groups in the top decile, you see that it's really the top 1% which is driving those trends, right? So as here, it then came down for all groups, and then this explosive growth has really been just in that top 1%. All right, so 1% of the population, defined in this, by this definition, is garnering most of this income. All right, so a couple of other patterns to show you what's been happening. So let's skip 3, 4 gives you another idea, just to show you the patterns in income distribution. Okay, so over here, this breaks it up into different parts, but if you look at this period here, you can see that average growth in income was about 13% over the period. But if you look at this, in the bottom 99%, they had about 6%. The top 1%, almost 60%. So the fraction of total growth during this period, captured by the 1%, is 62% of the growth. All right? So this gives you an idea of what happened to income inequality, gives you an idea of what groups in society are really capturing most of the growth. You can also see, by the way, we were talking about what happened, that slide of, is it Mr. Burns? Is that the character? Mr. Burns, I haven't watched that cartoon in a while. But you see that during the recovery after the financial crisis, you see there's been some income growth. You see the wealthy, the top 1%, were hit a lot during the recession. And the bottom 99 weren't hit as much. But if you look at what's happened during the recovery, the top 1% has grabbed most of the growth. The bottom 99% is basically flat. All right? So that cartoon is very accurate. Okay, so this gives you an idea, a couple of more slides just to give you different views of what's been happening during this period. This is from a talk that Alan Kruger gave right before he stepped down as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. This gives you an idea, once income inequality started to balloon, the rates of growth in different quintiles of the distribution. So if you look at these different quintiles, which are 20% of the distribution, you see in the top 20% we had this much growth, and as you move down, the growth was less and less and less. So very little growth among the poor. Most of the growth is the richer group. And again, if you split out this top 20% into just the top 1%, you can see what's happened there. All right? So this has been what's been going on in the country. And I think I have one more slide to describe for you some of these changes. Yeah, this is another interesting presentation. So what has this done to the middle class? This is a nice slide Alan Kruger put together. So during this period, the size of the middle class has fallen a great deal. And of course, the middle class can statistically define different ways. Here it's being defined as having an annual income within 50% of the median family income. So if you define that as the middle class, you see this was the size of the middle class, all right, back in 1970s, and it's dropped all the way down to here. All right? So our income in the United States has spread apart, mostly gone to the top groups. All right, so this is why there's been such an uproar. People are concerned about this, and people are trying to understand why this has happened. And I think most important, we always want to understand why things have happened, but whenever you ask a question, you always want to wonder why it's interesting. Why is it an interesting question? Why do we care? Okay? Now, when you think about what could loosely be called the American dream, Americans and many people are very tolerant of inequality of outcomes, so long as there's equality of opportunity. All right? So some people do much better than other people. Some people would say that's not good. We should try to level income and level outcomes. But many people would say we want to level opportunity, have a level playing field, and if they're very talented and hardworking, do really well, so be it. Other people would say no. Remember, capitalism is famous for generating huge amounts of economic growth, but also huge amounts of economic inequality. So this is one of the critiques of capitalism. But the key thing that usually bothers most people is the idea of lack of the opportunity to advance. All right? So this is one of the key other results, which isn't shown so much in Sad's work, but in other people's work, about the consequences of inequality. Very often people think inequality is an outcome, end of story. Some people are wealthier, some people are less wealthy. But that change in income distribution will have consequences for economic opportunities. All right? So when you're comparing outcomes and process, the outcome will affect the process for the next generation. And this is shown most graphically in something that's been, the name of it was coined by, again, Alan Kruger. It's called the Great Gatsby Curve. Any of you heard of this? You've all heard of the Great Gatsby, the novel. And so you had someone starting from, especially since it was remade as a movie recently, someone started from very humble beginnings and grew to great wealth. Of course, he did it through being a bootlegger, but nevertheless, the idea that you could start out low and rise up. So one of the areas that economists look at a great deal is studying mobility, income mobility. You can study mobility within a career, so whether or not people can tend to move up from the start of the career towards later in their career. All right, and although I'm not going to talk much about that today, that hasn't changed much. There hasn't been too much of a change in that. I'm not going to give you slides on this. People have found with men, within a career, the mobility has actually declined over time. For women, it's gone up. Right? But that's going to be a mix of women historically moving more and more into labor force. So it's not clear what that shows, but there's not that much movement there even within genders. But another type of income mobility, which I think is most relevant here, is what's called intergenerational mobility. And this is what the Great Gatsby curve shows. Because what it's looking at is, it's looking at the following phenomena. I pulled this from Kruger, but you can ignore this. What the Gatsby curve is showing is it's showing you the impact of your family's income when you were growing up on what income level you are likely to attain. So it's based on, so I didn't put it in slides, but it's based on a regression basically of this form. So you would run a regression of, I'll write it down precisely. So this would be the way where that comes from. So you have a regression. The slope of that line is this parameter. So what you do is you take the income of family I at time t, right? And then you look at the income for that family, and this is actually based on father's income and son's income. So although there are studies looking at women, the feeling is that over generations, part of that will be changes in people's feelings towards gender inequality and so on. So the best way to sort of not make that part of this picture is you just keep it with fathers and sons. All right, so that's what this table is based on. And the question is, how predictive is the income of your family when you were growing up on your income later? So this is an intergenerational mobility regression. So it's the same, it's using longitudinal data, it's the same family, and you're looking at how sticky income is across the generations. So the larger the beta parameter, the more predictive is the income in your family, well, actually over here, when you were growing up on your income today. See? If beta was 0, that means there'd be no association between the income of the family you grew up in and your income. As beta gets larger, there's more of an effect of your family, of where you grow up. So what you have here is this Grace-Gatsby curve is calculated across countries. On this axis, you're measuring inequality. I want to keep some of the technology out of here, but you're measuring inequality. You can measure inequality different ways. It's measured with something called the Gini coefficient. If any of you have taken this material, if you know what a Lorenz curve is, it's using a Lorenz curve to calculate a measure of inequality. But let's just say that's a measure of inequality, right? So it's a measure of income inequality. And over here, you're plotting the betas, these estimates. And as you move up in this direction, that means that income is stickier. Mobility is not as great because if the income that the family you grew up with highly predicts your income, that means mobility is not that great. All right? Where you start very strongly determines where you end up. All right? So moving up in this direction, less intergenerational mobility, and that's measured by this intergenerational earnings elasticity. So sorry, I specified that incorrectly. This is a logarithm. So this would be an elasticity. So in this log-log regression, this is the elasticity measure, and that's what's being measured here, this intergenerational earnings elasticity measure. And what you see here across different countries, and this has been calculated by many people, is that countries, this line, you sort of loosely fit a line through these different countries, is positively sloped. And what that means is that in countries exhibiting greater inequality, there's also greater stickiness of income across the generations. Or simply put, you grow up in a society where there's a great deal of income inequality, you're less likely to move away from where you start. All right? And this is one of the reasons why people are also very concerned, and I would also say I'm quite concerned about this, quite concerned about these patterns of income inequality, right? Because they're going to be transmitted to the next generation. Right? This is something to be very concerned about. All right, so it's not just that you have outcomes, but the outcomes also affect the quote-unquote American dream of being able to move up. You're born into a very unequal society, you're less likely to move out of where you started. Now, one of the questions might be why? And here's one of the reasons. Any ideas, by the way? Why do you think greater income inequality, don't worry, I won't call on you, but why do you think greater income inequality might generate less intergenerational mobility? Thoughts, yeah?
Societal factors, so people with larger incomes have, like, say, living in a poor neighborhood, then the child has less opportunities to achieve in a good school district or women opportunities.
Absolutely right, and this is very good. This is exactly what people are concerned about, that if you come from a lowest grade of income, unless public policy is such that children from poor backgrounds are allocated through public policy the resources so that their educational backgrounds and other investments in children outside of school, say whether or not they live in a crime-ridden neighborhood, whether or not there are dysfunctions within the family, and so on, unless you have social policy to try to even these out, where you start is going to very strongly affect where you end up. And I'm going to show you a slide about that. Yes?
I just wanted to comment on that because, as you can see at the Gini coefficient, where there are more the mobility in income, where it's also like the lower inequality. It's funny because in this term, like here you can see the Scandinavian countries, and I'm from Denmark, so I know the fact that in the society it's because, well, the government is like funding our education, so it's easier for us to like move between the sectors or in the industries of the society, in comparison to here where you're dependent on your parents' income, where in the Scandinavian model you're not, because the government through taxation, it's funded. So
you know, it's a good point you make, but let me make one point about that. What you're actually saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that even if some of these Scandinavian countries were over here, so even if there was a lot of income inequality, there would still be a lot of mobility, right?
Okay.
See, we're seeing these points here. It doesn't invalidate your point, but we're seeing these points here because these countries do not have as much inequality, right? And there's more intergenerational mobility. But because of public policy, it may very well be the case that if we had data points on these countries over here, and the government was still passing policy to ex post redistribute income, that we wouldn't see this type of low mobility. But what you see in many countries like the United States, is there's a paucity of redistribution of income. I'm going to show you how tax rates affect this and so on in a little while, from the wealthy back to the less advantaged groups. Right? So let's look at another slide just to point this out. This is something which isn't as well known. If you look at this, you look at family investments, and this is just one dimension of the investments in children. And you look at how much money families have spent on various types of what's generally called enrichment expenditures on their children. And what you're looking at here is this. This is the top income quintile, right? So we have the top 20%, and here we have the bottom 20%. And what you see over time is that expenditures on children have gone up in both groups, but in the bottom quintile, expenditures on children have gone up much more slowly than expenditures in the top income quintile. All right? So, but there's an interesting phenomena here. As income goes up, if this was just related to income, as income inequality goes up, expenditure on children become more unequal. And children will have poor, what's called human capital investments, and they will then tend to not do as well. But although it's not shown in this slide, one of the other interesting phenomena which has been found is that the wealthy, and by wealthy I don't mean the billionaires, I just mean people with hundreds of thousands of dollars of income, they spend a higher fraction of their income on children. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So the more educated and the wealthier are recognizing that we live in an increasingly competitive world, and they don't just spend more on their kids because they have more income, they spend much more of their income as a percentage on their children. One thing you've observed, and this would be a whole other talk, is if you look at test scores between kids coming from lower income families and upper income families, you find that these have widened over time. But they have not widened because the test scores of lower income kids have fallen. Those test scores are stable or mildly rising. What's happened is the test scores of kids from wealthier families have gone up at a faster rate because the parents are investing in them more. So this image that the school system is failing and in decline isn't exactly the correct picture. The school system isn't doing that much worse. It's just kids from upper income families are getting all these supplemental investments, Russian math, cello lessons, God knows what, and these kids are zooming ahead. Now a lot of people would say, well, you know, that's fine. I mean, it's not that the poor are doing worse, it's just the rich are investing more time in their kids. It depends how you think about it, but if you're competing for jobs, that creates a rather difficult situation. So this leads you, by the way, another point which has occurred here, let me show you one more slide, and then we'll start talking a bit more about some of the reasons for this. Let's see, educational wage differentials. This is something which, if you don't know it already, should make you happy. Over time, what we've seen is that educational wage differentials, so the wage premium has gone up. So this is a bachelor's or advanced degree here, a bachelor's degree. Here's the definition. These are calculated as a ratio of median wages for people with a 4-year degree or an advanced degree relative to that in high school. So this is a college, high school wage differential. All right, so you're calculating here the median wage of people with a college degree to the median wage of people with a high school degree. And you're tracking how that's changed over time. So back in about 77, if we just look at the bachelor's degree, people with a college degree were earning about 30% more, right? And over time, that has been trending up, right? So what this means is that the earnings differential between people with more education and less education has grown over time. And this has generated a huge amount of research for why this may be so. This could be easily a talk in itself, but the main reason that most labor economists feel is causing this is that our world is becoming increasingly complex. And as a result, the returns to knowledge are growing over time. This is generally called skill-biased technical change. So technical change is biased towards education and skills, and therefore skills and education is that much more valuable. There are other explanations. All right? But if I can just finish this and then I'll take your point, what this means is that the return to schooling has gone up, and the wealthier are investing more in their children. So you see it's a perfect storm. They're investing more, they're getting more education, and for any level of education, there's a greater return. All right, so things are splitting apart, and this will transfer to generations. So you can expect that the Great Gatsby curve will be alive and well in the future, and in fact probably more steeply sloped, because as income inequality leads to differential investments in children, that will lead in the future to even a greater splitting apart of the returns to kids, in the upper group versus the lower group, because they'll have more education. Yeah, John.
Aren't these differentials getting more and more specific to the field of study? Is it still across the board?
You can break these down by field of study, and I probably don't want to get talking too much about this, but you also find it generally to be true. But of course, in some fields, it will be different than in other fields. And again, you can talk about patterns of international trade here. One thing you may be thinking about, if this is happening, should supply and demand adjust? You find these educational wage differentials have actually dipped down at times and come up again. They follow cycles, because if the return to a college degree goes up, you'd expect supply would adjust, and you'd have more. So really what's happening is that demand increases for skills, supply adjusts, but demand keeps increasing, supply adjusts, but demand keeps outpacing supply. All right? So again, this could be a talk in itself. And this creates a lot of phenomena. For example, the fastest growing segment of the college student body is non-traditional age students, people who are 25 years and above. And one of the reasons that is happening is, this is some work that I did, is that you find that these folks decided not to go to college back in the day, then the return goes up, and they recalibrate, and they decide to go back to college. So you find a tight association, at least I found a tight association between enrollment at advanced ages and changes in these educational wage differentials. So these produce a lot of phenomena, but for our purpose, the key thing to note is that this Great Gatsby curve is changing the American dream. It's changing the idea that everybody has a chance to rise up, because the deck is being increasingly stacked against kids coming from poor families. Right? And that's something I think of a very great concern. Because remember, societies are most healthy when they're meritocracies. And you don't have a healthy society if you have a mediocre kid from a rich family going to the good schools, and you have a really smart kid from a poor family basically getting by. Okay, that's not a healthy society. All right, so so this is one of the reasons why this is a great concern. Now, let's think about what might be some reasons for this growing inequality. All right? Well, one I just gave you. One reason for this is this growth in educational wage differentials. Technology has been skill biased or knowledge biased. So what happens as a result is that you have this perfect storm where people who get more investment in schooling advance more quickly, and that spreads out the income distribution. All right? But there are other set of policies that we should be thinking about for why this is important. All right, so let's talk about some of these. Okay. By the way, I should also tell you these results from ZAS that I was showing you, just in case this occurred to you. Just put this slide back up quickly. I didn't copy this slide from his work, but I'll just mention it. And you can check it out. His talk where he presented this is all online. You can listen to it. But you find that in these early years, coming off of the Gilded Age, a lot of this income differential was based on capital income. You had these big industrialists steel, oil, and so on, the railroads, and a lot of the differential, if you break down their income into capital income, earnings, and so on, was based on capital income. A lot of that capital was destroyed, and when you look at this here, a lot of this differential here is not based on returns on capital, dividends, and so on, but these are earnings in the labor market. Right? So these are really earnings differentials, not the result of wealth differentials. But you can bet, as this occurs, what's going to happen to wealth? Wealth is going to accumulate, and in the future, in addition to any earnings differentials, you'll have an even greater dispersion as wealth kicks in, and you add to this income wealth differential effects. Right? So that's going to also exacerbate this pattern over time. All right, so what are some possible reasons which have driven these results? Okay, well, let's see. So, oh yes, there's one other slide I want to show you to think about this. You find differences in different countries, which is kind of interesting. Take a look at this. So if you look at comparable curves for the United States, the UK, and Canada, you find pretty much similar patterns, right? So the United States we looked at before, this was the data we looked at before. The UK and Canada pretty similar, right? So if you believe what might be driving this change in earnings inequality is skill bias technical change, and the people at the top are the very talented, well-educated people, and they're getting a return on that, and that's clearly part of it, you would expect this would be true across countries, right? Well, if you look at this for other groups of countries, you don't necessarily see it. So take a look at this. If you look at France, Japan, and Sweden, you do not find that growth, right? So again, coming off of the Gilded Age, although it wasn't the Gilded Age in these countries, but coming off of that period, then with the Great Depression, these incomes went down, and then they leveled. They haven't recovered. They haven't gone up again. Now, SAS interprets this as reflecting as evidence against skill bias technical change. Because he was saying if what's driving this is across the world a skill bias change in technology, then you should see it in these countries too. So that's his argument against that. Again, it could be a talk in itself, but there are other papers which show evidence in support of that hypothesis. But nevertheless, this is what he would claim, that it's probably not that. All right, so what does he mention some people have used to explain this? Well, the right-wing view of how you have these two different results in these countries versus the UK, Canada, and England is the idea that what happened in these countries is that regulations were put in place after the Great Depression, and those regulations were left in place, and those hindered economic growth and development. But what you saw in the US is the US underwent a period of deregulation, the UK underwent deregulation under Thatcher and so on. As a result of that deregulation, basically government regulations that impeded people rising according to their talents were basically removed, so they rose up. All right, so so they would say it could be skill bias technical change, but in these countries, government regulations basically kept the top people down. All right, well in the UK and England, those restrictions were taken off and people moved up. So that's one view. You can think about that. An alternative view, which SAS calls the left-wing view, is what's generating the general pattern. And he doesn't advance this to explain the pattern in these different countries, but what's generating this rise in inequality would be rent extraction. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about that. But the idea here is that it may be that people, you'll know what rents are, economic rents. When you talk about rent extraction, that would mean if there's basically a pile of money out there, people, this is not a precise definition, but if there's a pile of money out there, people are fighting over it. All right? So they're trying to grab that pile. Basically, if a labor contract is formed and it's a mutually beneficial transaction, there's usually some surplus there, and people can bargain over that surplus. That's one way of thinking of rent extraction. So what he was saying is what may be happening here is rent extraction, but the question would be why. Okay, and that relates to the idea of taxes. All right, so let's look at what's happened with tax rates. How am I doing for time? No, not too bad. All right, let's take a look at tax rates and see what's happened with inequality and marginal tax rates. Okay, so this is what we had before, right? This is the pattern of income inequality, right? And this is for the top 1%, where we see most of the action. And what you see in this dotted line is these are top marginal tax rates. And I guess you'll know we have what's called the progressive income tax system. So when you're in higher levels of income, you face a higher percentage of your income being taxed. But if you move into a higher level of income and you're in a higher tax bracket, that doesn't mean all your income is taxed at the higher rate, just that extra increment in income. That's the idea of marginal tax rates. So if you earn another $30,000 and that's in a higher tax bracket, that $30,000 is taxed at the higher rate, not the rest of your income. And that's what motivates behavior, because, for example, if I'm thinking about teaching a summer course, that puts me into a higher tax bracket, I'm wondering about how much money I keep in my pocket. It's the marginal tax rate which influences behavior. All right, so that's why he's listing the top tax bracket. And what you see here, if you look at this data, is you can't infer causation necessarily from this data, because saying one causes the other is a difficult question. But you do see a pattern here which leads one to wonder why it's there. And what you see is that when income equality was relatively low, marginal tax rates were very high. People scream a lot now about high tax rates in the U.S., but they're less than half of what they used to be. Tax rates have come down a great deal. So when top marginal tax rates were high, inequality was low. And interestingly enough, as the top marginal tax rates came down, income equality started going up. So again, you can't necessarily say that the tax rates are causing this. And by the way, this income share is pre-tax income. But why would you be seeing this pattern? Is there a relationship here? Remember, you always have to be careful in life generally, and certainly as social scientists, to jump from correlation to causation. Right? If you see a relationship, it doesn't mean one's causing the other, but it leads you to question whether or not one might be related to the other. All right, so how can we understand some of these? Well, there are actually three different hypotheses, but let me just talk about two of them. I won't talk about the tax avoidance model, but that's another possibility. Well, supply-siders or right-wingers would say this isn't at all surprising. And they'd say, well, what you see here is when tax rates are high, what do supply-siders say that does? Discourages economic activity, right? So if marginal tax rates are high, people are not going to work as hard, they're not going to exhibit as much work effort, and so on. So the top group won't care as much. And as tax rates go down, that's going to lead to a stimulus, and the top people are going to work that much harder. So this would be the supply side explanation. I'm going to look a little bit more about that in a minute. The rent-seeking explanation, and we'll also see a slide to look at that, would say the following. When tax rates are high, there's not that much benefit to be had from trying to get a higher income, right? So executives and superstars and sports figures and so on, they're not going to negotiate as hard for top incomes because a lot of it's taxed away. But then as tax rates go down, there are all those more benefits from generating those high levels of income, and that would be a form of rent-seeking. Now, if that was happening, that could be pretty serious for the economy, because if people are now seeing that they can get higher returns from salaries, if they're doing that by producing things, that's fine, right? But if they're doing that by, say, trying to influence governing boards and corporations and so on to give them higher pay, rather than, say, taking that money and investing it in capital stock, that's bad, right? So rent-seeking behavior is generally seen as not such a good thing. So these are two, possibilities. Now, let's take a look at some further analysis of this. So this isn't so much analysis, but also just showing you another way to look at some of these patterns across countries. The other result was for the U.S. You see that in countries with relatively low marginal tax rates, you see generally, so it's not just that last U.S. slide, that income inequality is pretty high, right? And again, this is pre-tax income. This is an income after taxes that redistribute income. So where high marginal tax rates are low, big income inequality. Where marginal tax rates are high, lower income inequality. So there seems to clearly be a relationship there. Now, this is an interesting result. Take a look at this. All right, if you look at what's happened to income inequality, or the amount of money going to the top 1%, with changes in these tax rates, you see another interesting result. You find that when tax rates have gone down, so you've reduced tax rates,